Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. All good. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome to Bilbao, first of all. I guess people are going to start coming in, so I'll have to be a bit repetitive in terms of the format. Basically, we have 6 speakers, including me. We're going to talk about the European market overview, obviously about wind energy installations, and we're going to have it in a format where each speaker has a presentation of around 10 minutes, followed by a Q&A for each of those speakers. So prepare your questions if you're interested in any particular country. So here you have the speaker list of the various speakers who are specialized in a number of markets. Here you don't see which one of them, but basically we're going to go through Europe as a whole, followed by German overview, followed by the UK, then we're going to go to Sweden, Central and Eastern Europe, and finish off with Italy. So with that, let's go to a European market overview. I'm going to share you some slides from Wind Europe. So I am Ivan Komušanac. I was the analyst at Wind Europe for, these are different slides. Analysts regarding collecting all the different statistics and the market outlooks for installations in Europe. There it is. And basically I'm going to walk you through our latest reports, setting the stage in terms of what's the situation today in terms of installed wind capacity, what do we expect, based on our report that we published in February. So, let's kick it off. Next slide should be working. Yes. Where are we today? 236 gigawatts installed. Obviously, the most installed capacity is in fact in Germany, followed by Spain. We have the UK doing quite well. Those are the dark blue bars, the amount of capacity in gigawatts installed in each country, and the red bars is the amount of demand covered by wind energy. So here, wind covered 15% of Europe's electricity demand in 2021. Those are the latest figures there. Among the ones that were the best performing in terms of integrating wind, obviously Denmark with 44% in 2021, but from other countries that are quite interesting here to mention, Ireland, 31%, all of it coming from onshore wind, Portugal, 26%, and we had also good figures in Spain, 24%, 22% in the UK. So that is both onshore and offshore wind. Today we're going to talk about onshore and offshore in the various markets, so it will be also applicable for me to mention a bit the offshore wind status in Europe. So basically 28 gigawatts installed. Here are the countries that have more than 100 megawatts installed. Obviously we have also a bit of a pilot projects happening in France. We have more capacity installed also in Finland, in Spain and Portugal, but those are markets that are yet to grow. So right now in Europe it's the UK who's absolutely leading here with offshore capacity installations, 13 gigawatts installed, covering 12% only from offshore wind in the electricity demand of the UK. From other countries, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, and Belgium are worth mentioning, and of course we have Sweden. If we take a look at how the wind installations have been developing the last few years, basically it had a bit of variations going down in 2018. Reasoning why was a lot of countries were switching from feed-in tariffs to auctions. So we saw a peak in 2017 in terms of developers trying to secure feed-in tariffs. Some countries have not been so good in implementing auctions. So 2018 we had a bit of a down year, but it's been slowly picking up, both specifically on onshore installations. And in 2021 we had 17.4 gigawatts of wind capacity installed in Europe. How did it look per country? Well, the UK installed the most. Why? Because it had 2.3 gigawatts of offshore wind for a total of 2.6 gigawatts of installed wind capacity in 2021, followed by Sweden, another market that we're going to mention today, which installed 2.1 gigawatt, the most onshore wind capacity installed in Europe in 2021. After that, we had Germany, which has been improving year on year after debacle in 2018 and 2019 in terms of onshore wind installations. And from other countries worth mentioning here, Turkey had quite strong installations, 1.4 gigawatts, followed by the Netherlands, 1.3 gigawatts, who was actually the country that installed the most in 2020. Going to the next slide, in terms of the geographical split, as I mentioned, Germany was the one that was usually the market that had the biggest market share in Europe because it was installing the most, but as of 2018 that was decreasing. Other countries have been picking up. So here you can see how specifically in 2020 and 2021 the market share has actually been a bit more diversifying and split across the different regions. What is the future for wind installations? With long story short, uncertain. We expect around 116 gigawatts to be installed over the next 6 years if governments really deliver on the promises they made for permitting. So there are some modest permitting plans for improvement. We've seen also in Germany some good announcements, but a lot of countries have not been doing that. There is the risk that countries implement even stricter permitting frameworks, which would cause this low scenario that we have, which is basically below 20 gigawatts of installing per year. This is how it looks in terms of onshore and offshore wind. Onshore will be the dominant here. Again, we quite a lot rely on onshore wind, but offshore wind we see a very big increase in installations, especially if we take a look here at 2026, 10.4 gigawatt driven by the UK. We're going to discuss this a bit later. And I'm going to leave you with one final thought, which is the EU has installed 15 gigawatts in 2021. If it wants to reach its 2030 target, it has to install at least 32 gigawatts each year, so more than doubling the capacity that we have now. So a lot of work left ahead of us. We are not there, and basically the idea is we're going to go through with five speakers now through a number of different markets. We're going to kick off with Germany. Mirko from the German Wind Energy Association, looking mostly on onshore wind, is going to walk us through the German situation. Mirko, you have 10 minutes, and for the audience, I propose you think of the questions and Mirko can tackle them after his presentation. Mirko, the floor is yours.
Good midday, it's a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me? Excellent, it's working. Yeah, okay, this slide is one in advance, I guess. Yeah, I'm happy to give you a little status update from Germany. News coming out of Germany, as we just mentioned, are quite good. We're optimistic about what's about to happen the next years. And let me quickly walk you through the developments we expect in the next 10 years. As a disclaimer, as Ivan just mentioned, we're an onshore association, so we're mostly focusing on onshore wind turbines. I'm still going to give you a little update on the ideas we have for offshore, but for more depth in this, you would have to talk to our colleagues from the Offshore Association. First of all, situation in Germany is we're quite far with the energy transition. We have now a share of 45.7% of renewables in the grid in 2021. And wind energy is now our biggest source of electricity with almost 23%. Then this happened. After the elections in September, we got a new government. We call it the traffic light government, as it is composed of the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and probably most important, the Green Party, which has put green energy at the core of their manifesto. Robert Habeck, some have probably heard of him, is now Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection, and he's the guy really pushing for more wind energy. Fortunately, we have an additional challenge that puts even more pressure on the German debate. As you all might know, 50% of our gas comes from Russia. That's a lot. We're unfortunately dependent on it, so this only reinforces the need for more green energy in Germany. So, and here's the scale of the ambition. I don't think my laser pointer works on this. No, it doesn't. Then, does it work that way? No, it doesn't. Okay, then let's just put it, yeah, that way. These were the highest numbers we ever had in Germany in 2017. We had an onshore expansion of a bit over, yeah, it doesn't work. We had an onshore expansion of a bit over 5 gigawatts. Then we had the slump in Germany that everybody heard of. Numbers were going down to just 1 gigawatt expansion in 2019. Then we're slowly climbing back from that valley of desperation. In 2022, we expect up to 3 gigawatts being installed and connected to the grid, and that is what we'll have in the auctions the next years. Only in 2023, over 12 gigawatts will be put to auctions within 10 years. So until 2030, we want to over double the onshore capacity that we have at the moment. I think it's 55 and about. By 2030, we want to have over 115 gigawatts of onshore capacity, which means, including repowering, that we'll have to add 70 gigawatts and about within 8 years, which I guess is quite extraordinary. So let's put it that way. The ambition is there. Now we're discussing how to implement this ambition and get the necessary reforms regarding permitting, like the availability of suitable lands, and obviously the biodiversity challenges we are facing. But yeah, the ambition is extraordinary. We are no longer discussing whether the numbers are high enough. It's just how can we possibly get there in the next years. Then let's go to offshore. This has been what has been added in the offshore area in the last years. The expected or the additions have been at maximum in 2015, 2 gigawatts or over 2 gigawatts, and we were expecting capacity increase to 12 gigawatts until 2026. But that was the plans of the old government. It's now been updated, and those are the new numbers. So by 2030, we want to have 30 gigawatts of offshore, 2035, 40 gigawatts, and 2045, 70 gigawatts of offshore, which honestly is probably going to fill most of the German maritime space we're going to have, apart from a few routes for shipping, and spaces where nature has to have a kind of refuge. From what our colleagues told us, it's just going to be as challenging as for onshore. We don't have that much problems with biodiversity, but it's just that supply chains have to be ramped up, and the industry, at least for 2030, will obviously do their best, but it's going to be challenging to meet that 30 gigawatts target, as it amounts to more than a doubling of the current capacity. Then we have the challenge that at the moment it only happens in the north in Germany. Regional governments are a bit reluctant. This is where we have to bring about change, because we need the energy in the south, where the industry is strong. As I said, those are the challenges we're now going to tackle in the next months: availability of land, permitting, repowering, biodiversity protection. We need a bit of change on state aid guidelines, and we have to face a market design reform. We hope to be done with most of this by the end of the year. It's structural reforms that take a bit of time, but we're sure that at the latest in 2023 or 2024, the numbers of installed capacity will rebound to levels that we haven't seen before. That's basically it. We're handing in a lot of papers, a lot of long papers with proposals on how to amend the laws we're currently having or how to reform them. And we're working like never before, but it's the moment for German energy policy to really make a big push. And here finally we have the scenario what we as an onshore association want to see by 2050. Now it's going to be 2045. This is a bit outdated. We see potential for up to 250 gigawatts of onshore capacity. This is where we want to get. It's going to be a bumpy road, but the commitment from the German politicians and the German society is there, and we're going to make this happen as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirko. We're going to pass the microphone around if there are any questions. So if anyone has a question to Mirko immediately, do raise your hand. We're going to pass the mic to you on German onshore wind, on German offshore wind. Until then, I will use the floor then to ask you a question. Let's start off perhaps with repowering and simplified measures for repowering. How are you seeing that advancing in Germany?
I didn't catch the last part.
Simplified permitting for repowering.
Like, we have 2 weeks ago published a long paper on how we're going to simplify repowering. We have a lot of proposals. It's just that this hasn't been on the agenda of the government. And basically the new government now after 3 months is expected to launch like a big proposal. It's a big challenge for them as well, because like before December within the ministries, like there has been no push for this. So within 3 months, they have to catch up on a lot of proposals. We're there to walk them through the ideas we're developing on a European level together with Wind Europe, and that we're doing in-house as well. The proposals are there. It's just that they haven't had the time to process this sufficiently, but they're going to do it before the summer break, and then the reforms will take effect from 2022 on at the very latest. At least that's the plans. And we've seen a lot of signs from the ministry that they're open to our proposals. It's just that we need a bit of more time for discussion in order not to shoot ourselves in the knees by, like, due to the hurry, implementing reforms that will not lead us where we actually want to be.
And I saw that there's going to be 16 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity leaving the feed-in tariff regime in the next few years. So definitely a lot of capacity that's going to be looking.
Yeah, and just yesterday there has been a press conference between two ministers, so Mr. Habeck and the Minister of Transport. We're talking about a volume they now probably have freed. We have to look in the fine print, but basically just by like a streak of, they just eliminated a small part in the law, freeing immediately. We expect between 4 to 6 gigawatts of capacity that can participate in auctions mostly next year. So we're going to fill those 12 gigawatts, hopefully.
Okay, very good. Any questions in the meantime? Okay, a bit shy audience, but I think I have that in time for one more. In terms of permitting, how is the situation looking in terms of new permits being awarded, in terms of capacity, in terms of gigawatts each year? Are we seeing an upward trend, but can you elaborate maybe a bit more on that?
The permitting situation in Germany still isn't perfect, since like when permitting takes place at the moment, it's still under the laws passed by the old government, which hasn't been ambitious at all. So the acceleration and the progress we're going to see in permitting, that will probably take another half year to a year before it really like takes off, which is why we have those like short-term potentials when we look at military, at radars, and at transportation. I was just talking about that. We want to use to like fill this gap we're going to have before the structural reforms take effect and hopefully get us to the 10 gigawatts per year.
Okay, very good. Any questions? Last call. If not, thank you very much, Mirko. I can leave it to me. Yeah. Cool. Well, from the largest onshore wind market in Europe, we're going to move to the largest offshore wind market. So with that, I'm going to call Albert Clark, from who's head of offshore wind at the Department of Industrial Trade. Pardon. Yeah, okay, you can do it on your own. I'm going to give the floor to you. Give the clicker also. I can take. You have the word. Okay, cool. With that, yeah, kick it off.
Hello, can everyone hear me when I speak into this? Brilliant. Great. So just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Albert Clark and I head up our offshore wind team at Department for International Trade. So as it was just alluded to, we're going to focus a lot more on kind of the offshore wind side of things on this presentation, as it's really the strategic priority for government at the moment in comparison to onshore. But to kind of quickly run through where we are in the UK at the moment with offshore wind. So we're obviously one of the world leaders for offshore wind with 10.4 gigawatts of installed capacity. We were the leader until just last year when we were overtaken by China, but we're still like rapidly deploying in comparison to many other countries internationally. We're obviously committed to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, including a very ambitious 1 gigawatt of floating offshore wind as well. So the smart mathematicians in the room will kind of realize this will require around 4 gigawatts deployed per annum to meet these targets. And a lot of, like the Climate Change Committee have estimated that we could need up to 100 gigawatts of offshore wind in the UK by 2050 to meet net zero. So there's huge capacity and huge pipeline coming through in the UK. And we expect that up to 50% of the 100 gigawatt capacity could potentially come from floating as well. So UK government at the moment is moving a lot towards kind of floating offshore wind and how we can capitalize on the benefits in this area as well. So just to quickly touch on where we are with onshore as well. So we currently have 14.2 gigawatts installed of onshore. So some of you may be surprised that we actually have more onshore in the UK than offshore, but over the next few years, we expect that to be overtaken by offshore capacity. In March 2020, we did announce that onshore and other POT1 technologies can bid into the contract for difference again. So there will be some projects in allocation round 4 that's upcoming, but smaller scale in comparison to our offshore wind projects, where we'll see potentially up to like 3 gigawatts, whereas with onshore, it's probably only up to around 300 megawatts. And our UK, which is one of our big trade associations, has set an ambitious target of 30 gigawatts of onshore wind in the UK by 2030 as well. So I just wanted to quickly talk through the contract for difference. So this is our renewable deployment mechanism in the UK, and it's one of the major reasons that we've had such good success in our offshore wind deployment. So how the contract for difference works in kind of like a whistle-stop tour is that you have kind of a government-backed contract for 15 years. So say if you bid in for your strike price that you can deliver offshore wind at £40 per megawatt hours, anytime that electricity prices drop below that price per megawatt hours, you have a government backing that we will support you up to reach that £40 strike price. And every time that the cost of electricity is above the £40, the developer pays back money. And it's actually a tax on consumer bills and consumer levies. The reason why this is quite interesting is because when we originally deployed the contract for difference, it was kind of costing the consumer around £1 billion per annum, and it went up into this more into the second year. Now with the like astronomical electricity prices across the world, we estimate in around the first quarter of this year, it could be giving back at least £500 million to the consumers. So it's actually taking money off consumer bills to deploy renewables in the UK. So that's a huge success from our side. And hopefully one day the contract for difference won't really even need to operate as well. And it can all be done on commercialized aspects. So this, I'm not sure if you can see that slide, but there's been huge success, particularly in offshore wind through the contract for difference. So around like 6 years ago when we launched allocation round 1, the strike price per megawatt hour was around like £120. Over 6 years, that price has been driven down to like under £40 per megawatt hour. So there's been huge reduction in costs in renewable deployment, and we expect that price to go down even further in the next allocation round. So we're currently going through allocation round 4, and we've deployed just under 10 gigawatts already, and we're expecting around like between 6 and 7 more gigawatts to be issued through the next round. And I'm sure everyone kind of knows the scale of offshore and onshore wind, but the largest project we've delivered so far was Dogger Bank in allocation round 3, and that was 3.6 gigawatts of offshore wind. And the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide shows that the size that takes up is around the size of Greater London as well. And there's only 300 turbines in that, which just shows that there's a lot of like leasing and planning constraints that you need to consider. So this is just a bit of an idea about leasing in the UK as well, and kind of how we're like driving forward our deployments as well. So we recently launched ScotWind. So on the 17th of January this year, the winners of ScotWind are announced, and there was 25 more gigawatts of seabed leased in Scotland. So 10 gigawatts of that is fixed, and then a pretty crazy number of 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind was leased through that round. So you can really see why it's becoming a major priority for UK government. But the benefits from floating are not only kind of in the north, in Scotland and the northeast England, there's major benefits around the Celtic Sea as well. So we're expecting up to 4 gigawatts of floating to be leased in the Celtic Sea next year. So it's constantly going up, it's constantly improving, which is brilliant to see. So what we're really doing now from UK government perspective is trying to learn from the lessons of fixed bottom offshore wind to carry over into floating and into onshore as well. So there's kind of a famous example in the UK of a factory being built where they didn't think that blades could go above 80 meters in size for offshore wind. And the latest generations of turbines are potentially going up to around like 111 meters. So they're having to demolish their factory and rebuild it so they can account for this scale. So we really want to make sure in all our policy design that we're future-proofing and accounting for this. We're also trying to innovate. So we launched a floating offshore wind innovation program recently that focused on like developing floating innovation in the UK, and 11 winners were announced with £63 million of innovation funding gone to them to try and drive this innovation from the UK. Infrastructure is obviously key. So we announced 2 major manufacturing hubs in the UK over the past 18 months. So one on Teesside and one on Humber. There are huge spaces of land that you can really like accommodate all the lay down areas of these huge components that you need to deliver offshore wind. And that's a really good way to like amalgamate benefits and drive down costs as well. And then obviously there's just a tailored strategy and understanding of limitations. So we know that floating offshore wind is going to be huge in Scotland. We know it's going to be huge in the Celtic Sea. Do we need special purpose ports and those kind of areas to account for this? So there's obviously barriers to further deployment. So we've kind of talked there a bit about the infrastructure that we require in the UK, but over the past 2 years, we've announced up to 320 million, to the development of fixed bottom and floating offshore wind. So this is to really ensure that we have the correct infrastructure in place. So the Teesside and Humber ports are through that. And then we're going to be trying to do the same through floating offshore wind to just ensure that infrastructure is not a barrier to deployment for us. And people have obviously seen the scale of like floating turbines and things, but they're huge and the laydown space that you need is massive. So we need to really be improving our ports across the UK. Obviously, ambitious commitments to floating and fixed bottom. Whether or not we'll get a target for onshore wind remains to be seen potentially soon, but this is really what we want to give to industry to ensure that we can deploy quickly. And then there's a huge wide range of programs across the UK to address leasing and grid consent. So a lot of the projects you saw in Scotland can't get grid connectivity until around 2033. So it's brilliant to have these huge kind of lands leased, but how can we speed up our grid connectivity? And there's currently a program ongoing through UK government called the Offshore Transmission Network Review, the consultation response to be due this year. And that's kind of addressing concerns of grid connectivity with industry. And we've been working really closely with them to understand how we can maximize deployment. And then obviously leasing, we're trying to group everything up into better leasing consent rounds to kind of prevent the delays. So we have an example of a few projects that bid into allocation round 4 that have had to split their projects because they didn't get environmental consent. So we want to prevent that happening in the future, because also if you deploy in groups, then obviously you have amalgamation benefits that the UK wants to see. And then finally, we've kind of moved to annual auctions. So the CFD used to be biannual, but we do it every year now just to ensure that there's a consistent deployment rate of renewables in the UK. And the contract for difference covers pretty much every renewable you can think of. So it's brilliant to know that each year developers can keep bidding in, and if they have consent issues 1 year, they won't have to wait another 2 years to be able to deploy. And obviously close collaboration, we need industry. So please come and talk to us and share your ideas about how we can deliver. So I probably won't go through this slide. I'll just leave it on the board, but there's just a forward look of kind of things that we've got coming up in the UK over the next few months and in 2022, basically, just to keep your eyes out and peeled. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. I would start maybe with the CFD auction round. Very good. This is definitely something that the industry welcome, moving from biannually to annually. Can you maybe tell us some hints when should we expect the results of this auction round?
So I think it's on gov.uk now, but I'm going to have to say in due course. And then if you go on to gov.uk, I think the official dates are out, but it should be in a matter of months. It's not long before the results come out.
Okay, very good. Any questions on the UK market? No hands up so far. Then I can again take the floor with the questions. What do you see as the biggest challenges right now for offshore wind, but also onshore wind? You mentioned infrastructure, you mentioned grid issues. Is there anything else, and what will you put as, let's say, a priority one thing that needs to be changed in the UK?
So to be honest, I don't think there's anything else, but what gives me sleepless night is grid connectivity. So we have a lot of projects that are like raring to go, particularly in ScotWind, and some of them, like a lot of the earliest projects have grid consent in 2033, and some are even like later on until 2036. So until the government like streamline those processes, we won't be able to deploy at the rate we need to, but it's a huge priority across government for this, and the Prime Minister has done a lot of speeches recently about the importance of speeding up these processes. So I imagine in kind of the energy strategy that's supposed to be published, again in due course or imminently, that we'll expect to see kind of like policies to hopefully speed that up, or at least a high level steer that we're going to speed up those processes in the UK. Okay, very good. Electrification versus hydrogen. Anything on that? Do you see opening now more with the current grid challenges for electrolyzers, in particular for offshore wind? Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of space for it. It's obviously still like a very nascent technology. So particularly in like my department in BEIS, there's a lot of green hydrogen colleagues working on this of the best way we can maximize the benefits in the UK. And we're looking for like a load of various ways we can innovate in offshore wind. So there's a leasing round in Scotland at the moment called INTOG as well. So that's where we're trying to decarbonize oil and gas rigs. So it wouldn't be connected directly to the grid, but it would be connected directly to gas stations. So that's what we're looking at. So hydrogen and other areas like that is just things we're considering, but at the moment the policy is not quite there yet.
Okay, very good. Any final questions? We have a question. So Eva, if you can pass the mic. And please introduce yourself first and then ask a question.
I'm Dominic McEwen from Marsh in Denmark. Just a question about the grid connectivity. Is that a technical thing? Is that permits, or why is there a delay between being ready and not actually connecting to the grid?
So it's a question I'll probably have to take away. I don't know like the major technical details, but as far as I'm aware, it's a bit of both. So they need to get the permits to be able to connect into the grid, and also just technically with the amount of kind of renewables we're trying to deploy into the network, it's just such huge scale that the grid can't cope. So worth checking out the Offshore Transmission Network Review, the consultation we've got there that really goes into a lot of detail on that as well.
We have the consumption centers in the south, allow renewables coming up in the north. So all this paired up, but I think we're gonna solve it. Any other questions? If not, we do. Okay.
Hello, Roman from the German Wind Association. I was just wondering about the CFD contract, because that's a debatable topic right now in Germany too, with the high energy prices. And I wanted to know about what are your experiences now with the high energy prices in the UK? Like, obviously it turned out to be beneficial for the customers, but what about the deployment of wind energy? Isn't that like scaring investors off, or?
What do you mean, sorry, in terms of, I couldn't quite hear the final part of that.
Is it like scaring investors off or hindering like wind energy expansion?
The contract for difference?
Yeah, because right now it's like not very profitable for them.
So it's a good question. So some of kind of developers who are operating an allocation round 4 are going to be utilizing PPAs alongside a contract for difference. But if I'm honest with you, having a 15-year contract backed by UK government is probably what people value a lot more. So obviously the high value of electricity prices, you could probably try and go it alone now, but no one can really predict what the prices will be in the next 10 years, maybe still high, but having that 15-year guarantee, you can really forecast your profit over the whole time. So for them, that's what they like the most. And that's why we've heard that they'll all still be bidding in consistently.
Okay, I guess no more further questions. Albert, thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is online. We will have soon visuals with Daniel. Daniel, hello, greetings from Bilbao.
Hey, greetings from Sweden.
The Swedish Wind Energy Association, a country that installed the most onshore wind capacity in Europe. Daniel, I give the floor to you. You have 10 minutes, and then we're gonna take some questions from the audience.
Thanks a lot, Ivan. I have to check before you leave my screen. Can you hear me down in Bilbao? Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for having this kind of hybrid opportunity. I was in the north of Sweden this morning, now going to the south of Europe, so it would be hard with a schedule if it wasn't able to do it via Zoom. I have some slides that I want to share with you to emphasize my message. And as I'm not getting the feedback, it doesn't work. I just will assume it works. So let's move on. So first, thank you for being here. Already said that. Always good to have that kind of first slide, so I don't forget to be polite. You know, the Swedes aren't known to do some extra talking. Well, I just want to give you some orientation where the Nordics are. The map is stolen from the Finnish Wind Energy Association. They actually have the most projects in their pipeline, so it looks more impressive than taking the Swedish or the Norwegian one. Maybe the Nordics are most known for the Vikings, for Santa Claus, and for the dragons, but I think it should also be known for being a huge wind power market. And despite having quite low population numbers, I think we'll see a really interesting growth and development of the market. Sweden is, as of now, by far the biggest wind power producer in the Nordics, but actually in the Nordic region, wind power is the second largest source of power after hydropower. And then many of the countries are also relying on nuclear, like Sweden and Finland have some nuclear power, and then coal power is a little bit below that. But yeah, it's 4% of the world market, more or less. I wanted to start with the technology development side, actually, before going into the market details, because what's going on in the Nordics in the terms of technology development is really, really interesting, actually. We have seen a very highly accelerating increase in installed capacity. So not only is the installed capacity increasing every year, I mean per turbine, the rate is also increasing itself, which means it's exponential growth. And from those 0.2 megawatt per year increase in the turbines installed, we now see a pace of almost 0.6 megawatt bigger turbines every year. And I'm sure you have seen a lot of releases of new turbines at the exhibition site down in Bilbao, but for example, the 7 megawatt turbine that came from Vestas is a perfect fit for the German market, and also each and every turbine manufacturer now has those 170 meter rotor machines with maybe 5, 6, or 7 megawatt generator, and that's just great machines for the Nordics. And the pace that the technology development is going is really astonishing. And I think for all Finland will take over. Sweden have been driving that technology development for a long time and have been the first market for many of those turbines. But I think Finland will take over that position because they have slightly lower wind speeds and slightly more generous permits. So they give away some 300 meter total height permits, and for big sites. But I think we will see a continuing increase in the turbine size. So look to the Nordics if you want to see what's coming around the corner, I would say. But still, the Nordic countries are quite different. Finland is they've always been an importer of electricity. They have been relying on importing from the east and also from Sweden and Norway. And Sweden is the biggest exporter of electricity. We're actually the biggest exporter of electricity per capita in Europe. And we have also different drivers. I think now when Finland is growing and building out their nuclear capacity and their wind power capacity, security of supply and independence is a really, really strong driver. And in Sweden, I mean, having this position with exporting a lot of electricity every year, it's rather the electrification that drives it. I mean, all these new, very exciting investments in new industries. For example, from Spain, the Fertiberia, the biggest fertilizer producer, is coming and establishing in the north of Sweden. We have a number of fossil-free steel production projects coming online. We have lots of hydrogen production and other e-fuels, for example, for the shipping, like methanol the ammonia, and so on, and not the least the battery factories, the Northvolt factory in the north of Sweden that's already up in pace, producing high volumes of batteries. So that's quite interesting. And in Denmark, of course, they have their own turbine manufacturers. They have the value chains around that. So they are pushing the boundaries with the energy islands. And in Norway, they have the really strong offshore industry that comes from drilling oil and gas, and now they want to go offshore with floating wind turbines. So it's actually a very dynamic mixture of drivers and technology choices and so on in the Nordics. And I could talk long about that, but let's move on and look at the market. And I want to start with the demand side. Sweden has actually set a target now of doubling its electricity usage. So I'm starting at the demand side, and doubling the usage of energy doesn't only come from buildings, as it might do down in Europe, where you use gas for heating and heating tap water. It comes from electrifying the industry and maybe eliminating some biofuel, and from growth, of course. And if we look at what it means in terms of capacity, doubling it means that we need to keep installing 2 gigawatt every year. That's the size of the market right now, about 7 terawatt hours. And that doesn't seem much, but now I'm only talking about Sweden now. But if we look at the more bullish scenarios, it's rather likely that we need to install maybe 8 gigawatt a year to be able to meet the demand for new green electricity in the different sectors of demand. Like transport is the smallest one, but industry is really the biggest one, and new kinds of industries. And we have done that before, actually, in the 70s. After the first oil crisis, we took away all the fossil fuels in the heating of buildings. So we electrified all the heating, and Norway did the same, and Finland as well. So, and we built out district heating. So I think we will be able to move on and do it again. Ivan showed some pictures earlier, but he didn't highlight the Nordics, politely enough, because he assumed I should do that, I guess. And as you can see, it's a fairly big part of the European market. Taking into consideration, it's not very populous nations, and the only dark clouds on the sky is probably the social acceptance, as in all countries. I would say it's hard to win this beauty contest, and we need maybe to find new tools for doing that. And we are working really hard in Sweden with creating local tax incentives and creating benefits for the local community. But in the forecast, the numbers are decreasing. So yeah, that's a little bit negative way to round it off. But I think it's also good to see that if we're going to manage this great transition, this green transition, we need to work a lot with addressing the local benefits, and that should be maybe one of the highest priorities. Actually, I realized I didn't talk so much about offshore, and offshore, of course, that's also a big thing in Sweden. And in the Nordics, it's a very merchant market, and Sweden is one of few countries that doesn't use auctions. Earlier today, this morning, the government had a press conference, and they just gave. They are going to look at new rules for granting exclusivity to area. So, because as of today, many companies are like looking at the same spots for offshore wind, creating a competition environment that's maybe not optimal. So I think that will be really interesting to see how the rules now will change in Sweden for that. But there are no intentions of not keeping the market very merchant. So there will be no subsidies for on or offshore wind, and the market itself is handling that through PPAs. So the contracts for difference and so on. It's not really a discussion in Sweden. Well, I think that's about it. Thanks a
Daniel,
lot.
We give you applause from Bilbao. By the time people start thinking about questions, I'm going to ask you the first question, which is grid development. What's the status now with the grid challenges we have in Sweden? We have obviously a bit of an issue with consumption centers being in south of Sweden and allow wind being in the north. How do you see that developing, and is perhaps electrification a way to solve it?
Ivan, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I should maybe have emphasized it, that in this transition, the load balance is also shifting. Since northern part of Sweden and northern part of Norway have the lowest energy prices in the world, maybe due to huge amounts of hydropower, and now we have built wind power on top of it. And remembering that Sweden is a huge net exporter of electricity, all these new demand is located in the north. It's almost without exceptions. So we see that, I mean, people are living in the south as well, but we see that there are so many new industrial incentives that it will really shift that balance. So the northern part of Sweden will have higher demand than southern part of Sweden. With that said, of course, the grid issues is very important, and as in many other countries, the transmission system operator haven't really been agile, haven't really been forward-leaning and wanted to be first on the ball. But we see a cultural change there now, and they are trying to ramp up their capacity to make investments and so on. So that is a problem, has been a problem, but I think that's actually one of the problems that can be solved, I would say.
Okay, we have one more question that came online for you, which is, could you elaborate more on how the wind farms are contracted? If it's not through an auction, how it is. So you can talk about PPAs or merchants, and how do you see the market also, not only now, but how do you see it developing in the short term?
I see we had a huge backlash last year during 2021 that wasn't windy at all. And since almost all parties have long contracts, since it wasn't windy, they couldn't fulfill their deliveries. Some parties have to buy really expensive electricity in the end of the year to fulfill their annual deliveries, which was very costly. So now I can hear some gossips about actors wanting to take even more price risk, and also in this energy crisis environment, it seems like electricity prices aren't going down, except in north of Sweden, where it's kind of trapped because it cannot be transferred further south. And I think if you build wind power now in southern Sweden, you might do it totally merchant and taking the price risk, or try to find some buyer that want to have a PPA for a part of your production. But I would say it's it's probably another kind of market than in many other European countries, and And considering it's still quite a big market and investment rates are high, I guess there are enough of investors with that kind of risk appetite, or yeah, it's also a chance. I mean, one hand is a risk, on the other hand it's a chance. So yeah, that's my elaboration, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, Sweden does have one of the most PPAs contracted in terms of renewable capacity in Europe, so that's also one explanation. We have economies of scale playing effect. Not only, as you said, the most powerful turbines are being ordered there, but the wind farm sizes are enormous compared to the rest of Europe. So all this obviously plays effect. Thank you, Daniel. Greetings from Bilbao.
Thank you,
we'll
Ivan.
leave you to it, and yeah, wish you a nice day.
Same to you. Take care. Bye-bye.
So our next speaker is also going to talk about the regional overview, not only focused on one country. We have from the EBRD, Director for heading actually Energy Affairs, Grzegorz Zielinski. I hope I pronounced it correctly. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Grzegorz Zielinski. I'm a Director for Energy Europe at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and I'm going to take you through a region which may not necessarily be as well known to you as the big markets that you've heard about before. And it's going to be really difficult to talk about 30 or even 20 countries in the next 2 weeks. So forgive me for being very general and just touching a little bit here and there on the issues and opportunities in those countries. But let me start with a very quick 2 or 3 slides on EBRD, which is a multilateral development bank set up in 1991 to foster transition in the former Soviet bloc countries. We are owned by 70 odd sovereigns with a capital base of 30 million and majority owned by the countries of the European Union. But that's our geography. This is where we work. Everything that is sort of non-shaded or in white is the EBRD region, which effectively means the former Soviet bloc plus the subsequent extensions like Turkey, Greece, or countries in southern and eastern Mediterraneans. As I said, impossible to touch on every single market, but in the Energy Europe team, which I represent, we cover the European countries of our region. Together with our sister team, we invest roughly €1.5 billion each year across 35 projects or so a year. And this slide gives you a little bit of a feeling of what we have done so far in Central and Southeastern Europe. Now, you would see here the countries that may be considered main or big markets from the European perspective, like Poland or maybe Romania. But you will also see that there are markets where the penetration of wind is very tiny or hasn't even started. And that's where most of our work goes in at this stage. So this region that has not seen a big wave of investors to the extent Germany or Sweden or the UK has, is really in the need of new investment in renewables. And that's because they do have a huge problem with energy intensity. Effectively, every single country in the region we cover has energy intensity that is substantially higher than what you see in Western Europe. The same comes in relation to CO2 emissions, with countries which are based historically or rely historically on fossil fuels, being shaded in dark colors, and absolutely desperate for a shift from fossil fuels to renewables. And some of that shift is happening. And that slide represents how much of the new non-hydro renewable energy capacity has been installed in some of these countries. Surprisingly, Ukraine, which is here in a little bit sort of darker green, has been doing really, really well before the war. Obviously, now it's not. So my last slide on this part, which is not here, is obviously the impact of the war in Ukraine, which in terms of energy security is pushing all the decision makers into the acceleration of renewables in the region. And the closer you get to Russia, to Belarus, to Ukraine, the more you see the authorities saying, yes, we have to do something right here, right now. So how do we do it? Now, investing, in a way, is easy because we do it exactly the same way as any other commercial bank or rational private sector investor. But before we get there, we need to prepare the grant. So that's what we call a policy dialogue. That's where the institution, development bank like EBRD, gets into discussion with our authorities in the region, with the stakeholders, trying to first convince them why investing in new renewable energy capacity is so needed for the country. This has been really difficult in the past. It's easier now when the cost of renewables have gone down, but it's even easier in the last few weeks when energy security issue just took over all the agendas and is absolute number one. Once we have someone on the side of the authorities absolutely convinced that new wind or new solar is the way forward, we move into the technical cooperation bit when we try to mobilize grant financing to pay for the consultancy that's needed there to amend the law, come up with the renewable energy auctions or framework, look into the grid connection rights, just to prepare the grant for private investors to move in. And then finally, with the investments, that's where EBRD provides financing, whether that's senior debt or equity or mezzanine or whatever is actually needed for a given project. This slide represents the obvious trend of reduced prices, which comes as a result of renewable energy auctions. The red bars are the ones that relate to EBRD countries of operations in the region. So effectively everywhere you see a push or a squeeze on the results of the auctions, which is very much welcomed by the authorities, but not necessarily very much welcomed by the investors. And I come back to that in a couple of minutes. So our policy engagement, very much in making in countries marked in blue, but with a little bit more touch on countries that may not have been of interest to you, or you may not have seen them in the past. In Croatia, for example, the ongoing discussion on a new wind capacity auctions for 300 megawatts, but at the same time, a substantial work in the study on the grid to ensure the connection opportunities for new wind farms are there. In Albania, which is, by the way, not many people know that that's the only country in our region, one of the very few in the world, that has a domestic power generation, 100% renewables today, predominantly hydro, but also some PV solar. But what they need desperately is some wind for balancing reasons, etc. So they are coming up with a new auction. EBRD has worked extensively hard in Serbia to come up with a new framework for wind and solar, and that work has been substantially completed already last year. The elections in the country that have taken place last weekend hopefully are going to unlock the next stage, and we're really looking forward to working with Serbian authorities to implement those auctions that are expected to deliver tangible results pretty soon. Now, I've mentioned about these auctions which are being loved by the authorities but not necessarily liked by the investors, and squeezed pricing, etc. This is the example of fully merchant wind project that the EBRD has financed in the region. It has been made on a very specific request of our client, who was ready to go, who could not wait with the construction, who wanted to participate in the auctions that were not coming at the time, and who said, okay, fine, let's do it merchant. So it is possible to do merchant wind in Central Europe, in Central and Southeastern Europe, or further south. Obviously, it requires a much bigger commitment from the side of of the investors. In this particular case, the transaction has been structured, executed, closed with the first disbursement on fully merchant basis. But a few months later, this very project has actually won in the auctions and flipped into a contract for difference, just for the record. So what I would like to end up with are 4 slides just touching on 4 other markets which we see particularly exciting from our point of view. First, Greece, which we praise every time we talk about what's happening in the country, especially because of the very firm and strong commitment of the authorities to phase out coal and to move full steam ahead with development of renewables. So almost 9 gigawatts of new renewable installed capacity is expected to come live before the end of this decade. And that includes solar PV, that includes onshore wind, but that also in due course will include offshore floating. By the way, I haven't mentioned that earlier. We talked or heard about offshore wind quite a bit earlier this morning in this and earlier sessions. But please note, there is no single offshore operating wind farm in the region that we cover. It's just a matter of time they will come. There's still nothing in operation today. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Greece, but also Croatia, but also Bulgaria and Romania, all talking about potential offshore. We will see that in the coming years, hopefully with the first offshore projects being commissioned for construction within the next 18 months or so in Poland. That's our prediction. Anyway, going back to Greece, huge opportunity for new renewables, but at the same time, ongoing policy dialogue, especially on offshore wind, floating wind in the country. Romania, another large or largish country in the region, has gone through ups and downs over the years. They were the ones who introduced green certificates system in the past that went a little bit pear-shaped. Now the country is preparing contracts for difference with the tender expected in early 2013. So we do expect big opportunities. This country is both Greece and Romania are already a little bit busy in terms of amount of interest and fight for good sites and good projects. It is what it is, but opportunities are there. Second last, Romania, new government, new opening, new push for renewables, again, with a huge expectations of increasing renewable energy capacity and reduction of the reliance on fossil fuels, including the domestic lignite within the Mauritius complex. And last but not least, my native Poland, which has been really struggling to say or kiss goodbye to coal and lignite. I'm really afraid that in the context of the war in Ukraine, we will not really see a huge acceleration of decarbonization in the country, but we will see a big acceleration of renewables, and that's predominantly wind and especially offshore, but also the famous 10H rule that has to go. And I wouldn't bet my pension money on that, but I really hope we will see that rule changed literally in the next couple of months or so. I will stop here with a huge thanks and ready to answer your questions.
Thank you. Very interesting to cover multiple markets. If anyone has any particular question, otherwise I'm going to kick off, which is for all those countries where the EBRD has been present in terms of wind, which one for you right now has the best policy scheme to basically, from your perspective as a bank, that it offers the most security, that there's the least amount of risk that you see there? So obviously some country that has a support scheme like an auction, but what do you see as the preferred option currently?
Well, my answer is going to be slightly biased. It's not necessarily what we as the EBRD see as the most secured market, but where we see the biggest opportunity, and where that security, which is missing today, can be created through policy dialogue in a matter of the next 6, 12 or 18 months. Clearly, out of the lot, Poland and Greece are the most developed markets that attract the biggest number of investors. That's also the markets where ready-to-build projects are priced very high, and that's the two countries where we see a lot of interest of commercial banks to be ready to finance under the existing and fully tested schemes. Then the next sort of group would include the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, and maybe Serbia as well, where we see investors already fully convinced that even if there are shortcomings here and there, the regulation is going to be in place. But then we've got the whole lot of the smaller countries, whether that's Montenegro, Kosovo, which are not even on a remote radar screen of the investors. But the opportunities are there, provided that someone is sort of brave enough to move into these countries.
Okay. Any questions on any of those markets? You just can raise your hands up. We're going to bring a microphone, so don't be shy. But so far, no questions. I'm going to ask one more. We talked about different policies. PPAs. We see that happening in Poland. How is the bank involved with corporate power purchase agreements in the region?
It's a very good question. Thank you very much for that. I mean, when you talk about PPAs, the financing bank, the bank that finances the project, obviously looks at the risk of the PPA offtaker. So the bigger the name, the better. And we really see in the advanced transition countries, in Central Europe, in Baltics, people like mobile phone operators, IKEAs of this world, all interested in offtake agreements, and they are able to provide very solid offtake arrangement. But obviously, they don't want to commit to unknown price in the future. So even though you do have the offtake in terms of the volume, effectively, you always end up with some sort of a merchant risk, one way or the other. And that's tricky in a way, because lenders in the region are not fully prepared to take a merchant risk. But at the same time, with the big names, which I've mentioned earlier, slowly the market is moving in this direction. Now, we have actually worked in the autumn of last year on an extremely exciting project with a large PPA in Ukraine. Naturally, due to the war, this work has been suspended. But the energy-intensive industry is another very interesting group of potential off-takers who are able to commit to long-term offtakes with fixed pricing. So I think it's happening, and there is going to be a move towards more of the corporate PPA structures in the region.
Okay, especially now with the high electricity prices, definitely. I also see some developments where I would never guess that energy intensive would sign such a long deal. They're considering it now. Any questions? Final call. Otherwise, thank you very much, for the good overview. And we have the last speaker, Alessio from Elettricità Futura, to represent Italy. Alessio, the floor is yours. You have around 10 minutes, and then we go with the Q&A. Here you go. Here you go. Make your hand also.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to give an overview around Italy and the wind energy market over there. So as Ivan rightly introduced, I'm from Elettricità Futura. We are an industry association. We represent the 70% of the electricity market in Italy. So not just wind, but the overall sector with all sources. But let's go to what's the status of the Italian market. First of all, we don't have offshore wind. We only have onshore wind at the moment. We have around 11 gigawatt of installed wind power. And as you can see from the slide, there's been a steep increase in the years after 2010, as in many other countries. And then in the following years, there's been a substantial stagnation in terms of new installation. In fact, in the last 5 years, we installed only around 2 gigawatt, 1.9, so less than 400 megawatt per year in the past 5 years, which is, as we will see, pretty low to what we are envisaging for the 2030 targets. Going back to this slide, one other interesting thing, as in many other speeches we've seen, that there is a resource, a wind resource is mostly in a part of the country, in the southern part of Italy and close to the islands, whereas of course the consumption, where the industry, the consumers is mostly in the northern part. This is one other consideration which of course is linked with the development of the network. Now, if we look at the perspectives, if we project to the Fit for 55 package, the 2030 targets, we will need to install another 13 gigawatts, so more than double the capacity we have right now, and of course, more than almost triple the production of electricity. With the current pace of installation, of course, this is not doable, as we see. This is for the onshore wind. Now, the National Energy and Climate Plan, the one published in 2019, as in the other countries, says that we also aren't going to install 0.9 gigawatt of offshore wind. But now, one interesting figure for Italy is that if we look at the request for connection to the network, to the high voltage network, we have in total around 180 gigawatt of new renewable power in terms of requests of connection, and half of this is wind. If we look into the offshore, this is actually 32 gigawatt of requests are into offshore, meaning that there is a request. We are now installing the first wind turbines, for instance, in the Puglia region, but there are many projects in the pipeline. So we see that at least by 2030, we could get to 3.5 gigawatt of offshore. And of course, given the characteristics of the Mediterranean, floating offshore is definitely a very interesting technology. If we look at more broadly at the mix in terms of capacity, and we look at what we have today, so in total Italy has got less than 60 gigawatt of renewable capacity. And as I said, 11 of this are wind. If we look at the future, we see that solar will do have a very large share in terms of capacity, but also wind will have to more than double. So this is the spread, as you can see. So overall, we need to move from 57, less than 60 gigawatt today, to about 120 gigawatt of new renewable capacity by 2030. And those figures were elaborated before the energy crisis, before the energy increase. Now, one key element, one key bottleneck is, as in many other countries, I should say, is permitting. We analyzed what's the situation in Italy, and basically, on average, we have a 6 years delay in approving projects. So in many cases, it should take 1 or maximum 2 years to approve a project, but on average, we take almost 7 years. And this is overall renewable figures, but is really skewed by I should say the performance, the bad performance of wind permitting. So this is a very big issue, the major bottleneck we have in Italy at the moment. And unfortunately, we are in Europe one of the worst countries in terms of cost of permitting, so impact on the LCOE, and in terms of delays. In addition to that, what what we see, and unfortunately, I should say, the Italian government has been quite active on defining some measure like clawback measures that we've seen also in Spain, in Romania in the past month, and also add additional taxes. Recently, a 10% solidarity taxes for the energy price increase. We still have some, as I said, permitting bottlenecks. One of the key upcoming opportunity is a definition, according to the Renewable Energy Directive, of the go-to areas for wind and for renewable in general. This will be indeed one of the main drivers that we will see in the next few months. It's been approved in decree. Now regions will have to identify the actual go-to areas. And one other key constraint we see is that in many occasions there are retroactive changes to the regulation, to the spatial planning, and this is of course providing extra unplanned constraints on projects. In Italy, we also was introduced a few years ago a specific measure called Spalma Incentivo Volontario to modulate the incentive intensity over years, but this has created some, let's say, lack of level playing field, especially between repowering and the green field. Now, it's been partially solved. There's still a lack of, let's say, fair and complete fair level playing field. One of the key things that we are seeing is inflation. So many of the construction materials and components are seeing a price increase. And so this should be taken into account in the tariffs. But the last slide for me is what are we proposing now in the wake or in the midst of the energy crisis and geopolitical crisis we are all living. We think that what we've seen and what we plan for 2030 should be accelerated. Is not enough. We need to bring those plans forward, and we as Elettricità Futura have proposed to the institution to basically double renewable capacity in Italy in the next 3 years, not by 2030, because this could actually give a reduction of 20% of the import of gas for Italy, and Italy imports a vast majority, more than 90% of the gas come from outside Italy. It can create 80,000 new jobs and 85 billion investments in Italy. So really pushing hard with institution. We see that there's a political backing, but we still need to see that, let's say, the government is to buy in this proposal. So I thank you very much for your attention.
I will take the first question, which is auctions. So Italy is still running auctions for wind and solar, which is the most important for us here. They have been undersubscribed. They have been undersubscribed because of lack of permitted projects. Obviously, one issue is the inflation and indexing to inflation the different bids. I wanted to ask, what is now the future for auctions in Italy? Is there a framework, a new one coming up?
Well, you're correct. They have been heavily undersubscribed, especially on wind and solar as well, and so this has also raised the let's say the price. So we're very close to the auction baseline. So we could have been much lower. So we saw something like 65 euros per megawatt hour. So it could have been much lower. In terms of planning, what we've seen is there's still some gigawatt that needs to be put again into auction because they were not assigned. We've seen some, let's say, plan from the government, from the ministry to, let's say, do new auctions and also to define local and regional gigawatt distribution, which we think is a positive thing because of the resource availability in the south and the need for, in our case, to make sure that there's a good distribution around the areas where you have the wind resource. So, but from what we've seen, is not enough, of course. So the visibility is still limited. We need to see concrete actions. And also, there's a huge discussion around the potential changes to the market to make sure that you provide long-term price signals. So, like development of PPAs that today in Italy are very low compared to many other countries like Spain and the Nordics, if we talk about Europe.
Okay. And on offshore wind, we see a huge appetite by developers, Adriatic Sea, but also on the other seas that Italy is surrounded by. I wanted to ask, what's the future there? Do you see it being more linked to PPAs going merchant, or do you see it also a separate support scheme for offshore wind also?
Well, you're correct. It's a great potential for especially off the coast of Sardinia, Sicily. You have a very good wind resource. So in fact, many of the projects are over there, but as you mentioned, Adriatic Sea as well. But in terms of the let's say the startup phase, we are now a draft of ministerial decree with specific support schemes for innovative renewable resources, including offshore wind. So, and this is something that we've provided some comments. We think that the allocation could have been a bit more ambitious. So there is a potential development and attention by the government. We need to see the final version of it. And this, in my view, will be the first phase. Will definitely be helped by support like the one provided by the government to go more into, let's say, merchant or PPA based future in the coming years. But I mean, in Italy, this is really in the, let's say, very early stage for offshore, so it needs to develop pretty quickly.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Alessio on Italian market, both onshore and offshore wind? If not, I'm gonna finish then a bit earlier. Thank you, Alessio.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you everyone who joined us physically and online. I'll leave you to it to go around the exhibition or go to the conference session, and I wish you a nice day in Bilbao. Bye.